Hello, good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening to all of you around there. I'm very glad that you could make it, and I hope even more people will be able to hear the recording afterwards. So today we have a training with Courtney Soderberg from the Center for Open Science, who has kindly agreed to provide us all with a little bit of background to survey research, how to design it, why to design it, and kind of how to go about it for the research design itself to make the most sense and bring the most value. This training in general, we came up with the idea for organizing one because obviously a number of your initiatives clearly include an element of social research in your initiatives, and we thought it would be quite useful if you have a little bit more of a background in what that entails, maybe before you kind of start going out with the research, or maybe whilst you're designing your own surveys. I hope that this advice will really help you. So where Courtney will be kind of introducing you to all those survey-related theory and practice and best practices, please kind of think about it in the context of your initiative and what your plans are, and don't hesitate to ask questions related to your own surveys that you might have already started at the end during the Q&A. So, and obviously feel free to type the questions at any point during the presentation. We'll have quite a lot of time allocated to responding to those questions at the end of the session. Okay, so now I'll pass you on into the capable hands of Courtney Soderberg, and she'll tell you all about surveys.
All right, hi everyone. As Cora said, my name is Courtney Soderberg. I'm the statistician at the Center for Open Science in Charlottesville, Virginia. And just so you know my background, I have a PhD in social psychology. I studied kind of attitudes and social cognition, so a lot about attitude, behavioral intentions, and kind of biases in how people process information, which is some of what we're going to be talking about today when we talk about kind of how your survey respondents interact with your survey. And this is just kind of a really broad overview of some of the key points. The last slide is going to be kind of some further readings or information for you all. This is a really deep topic, so if you are planning to do a survey, I would highly suggest kind of digging into this more afterwards. So, right, so you think you want to do a survey. Surveys, there are a lot of pros to surveys, but they can also have some cons. So one thing that surveys can be particularly good at is they allow you to get a lot of data relatively quickly and sometimes cheaply, depending on how much you are paying respondents, if you're paying them at all. But they can be a lower lift in terms of data collection than other types of research, depending on exactly what you're doing. They allow you to measure a lot of different types of things, right? They allow you to measure attitudes, knowledge, and behaviors. And you can also look for relationships between these. So if you were doing content coding, you could maybe only pick up on behaviors and wouldn't necessarily know, well, maybe what's driving those behaviors. A survey might allow you to ask about both behaviors and attitudes and see how much those things are related to each other. Also, if the survey is done right and if you get good response rates, they can allow you to generalize from smaller groups to broader populations. Now, many other types of research allow you to do that as well. But a lot of times, this is one thing that surveys are used for, to learn from a small group about the general population you're interested in. As I mentioned, though, surveys do have drawbacks, just like any other type of research. In surveys, you are dealing with humans, and there are many biases that can alter how people respond to your survey. The wording of the questions, the wording of the responses, the ordering is really, really important. Kind of responding can be highly finicky. Even with something just about frequencies of behavior, this can be problematic, right? Human memory is fallible. So you can get inaccurate behavioral data, either just because people misremember or because of some response bias. So you're kind of dealing with two different types of issues when you're thinking about behavioral questions. You're also limited to what you can kind of think of a priori when you're asking your questions. So what I mean by that is, because in a survey you ask kind of everyone the same questions with some branching logic, maybe in a more complicated survey, you can't really ask follow-up questions that you didn't think about beforehand, right? If people start giving you responses that you weren't expecting, you can't follow those up and dig into them further like you maybe could in something like an interview or a focus group. So you really have to kind of know a lot about the domain you're going into so that you can capture the landscape of questions and the landscape of responses that you need upfront. So before you even start designing a survey, there are kind of a couple things you should probably do. The first is a literature review. So digging into the literature, and especially in survey work, that literature can be really broad because the surveys can pop up in many different places. You know, if I was doing a survey related to something around politics, previous work on that might show up in poli-sci, it might show up in political psychology, it might show up in kind of larger polling firms. So you want to kind of cast this net really broadly when you're doing a literature review. And the first thing is to just identify knowledge gaps. You know, make sure that this isn't a question that somebody has already answered, or maybe they've answered a part of it and you kind of want your survey to sit in the nook of space that really no one's looked at yet or assessed. Another reason to do a literature review is to find previously used questions that you might be able to adapt or just use in your survey. It doesn't mean that any question that shows up in the literature is a good question. There are some really bad questions out there. But sometimes you can find really useful questions. You can sometimes find, you know, validated scales on some more complex topics. If the same question is asked the same way by a lot of different people, that can be a sign that, hey, maybe this question has been validated and is kind of a good way to ask this question. So the literature review can be helpful for kind of both identifying potential questions and scales to use, but also just making sure that nobody's answered the same question before. You also want to write out really clear research questions. So exactly what are you trying to answer with your survey? I mean, for any research design, this is important, but I think for surveys, it can be especially important because the wording and the responses can be so finicky, and so you want to make sure that the questions you're asking people really are mapping on very, very closely to exactly what you want to find out. You also have to identify your population of interest, and we'll come back to this when we're thinking about sampling designs for the survey, but just who do you want to be able to speak to when you get your results in? Is this like all researchers? Is this researchers in a particular country? Is it professors? Is it grad students? Is it, you know, people with depression? There are a lot of different populations you might be interested in. The other thing you may want to do before designing a survey is to, if this is an area where there hasn't been a lot of work done, you may want to think about doing a focus group or informational interview. So that's when you kind of have a structured series of questions you're going to walk through with some people in your population, but you're more trying to kind of explore what might be worth asking people, what response options might be good to have to help identify potential questions for the survey. So once you've kind of done your pre-work, the next step is drafting your questions. There are kind of two broad philosophies on this. One is to throw everything at a wall you can possibly think of and then pare back and redraft the questions. The other philosophy is to write very, very specific questions that cover your research question and nothing more. Some people like one way, some people like the other way. I tend to get attached to questions So sometimes it could be better for me to do the second option rather than the first. But sometimes I will choose the first if I'm not sure what the best way to ask a question is. I may write a bunch of different takes on it and then kind of pair back to the one I want. But either way, you need to make sure that when you look over your research questions and you look over the responses that you will have, assuming people take your survey, that there's a really good match between the responses you're going to get and do those actually answer the research question you have. So there are a lot of different sources of error in terms of just people's responding to questions. And those can kind of be broken down into 4 broad categories. One is memory, which we talked about a little bit. So people may misremember behavior, especially older, less salient things. Like if you bought a house, you're probably going to remember that for a very, very long time. If I ask you what movies you saw 2 years ago, you are probably not going to be able to remember that very accurately unless you see almost no movies. Additionally, there's something called telescoping where people may, if you ask them about a certain time frame, people may include stuff before or after that time frame, so you get inaccurate reporting. Another big one is social desirability. You can get under or over reporting of behaviors that respondents see as more or less desirable, either because society sees them as more or less desirable, or sometimes because they think you as the researcher think it's more or less desirable. Another one is communication. So if respondents have a different understanding of your question than you do, they'll still respond to it, but the responses don't mean what you think they mean. Also, if they have different understanding of the question than each other, this can lead to a lot of variability in your responding. And then finally, knowledge. People don't necessarily like to admit that they don't know things. So if you're asking knowledge questions, they may respond even though they don't actually have knowledge on that topic. So I'm going to talk a little bit in depth about specifically behavioral questions and attitude questions because I think those tend to come up more frequently than other ones, but I do have some resources at the end for other types of questions. So behavioral questions, you're asking about, in theory, verifiable behavior. So, in the last year, how many papers did you publish? In the last 2 weeks, how many hours of TV did you watch per week? This could also be something like, do you go hunting? Or, what is your H index? Do you have a website? Like pretty much anything that is some sort of behavior. Some of those you could actually go and verify. Others, like how much TV somebody watches, is harder to verify, but it's still a behavior. And these questions can be sensitive or non-sensitive. And so what I mean by that is the sensitive questions are things that are likely to be affected by things like social desirability bias. People may be less willing to answer them or less willing to answer them truthfully. So some obvious things that would fall into sensitive are things like if you're asking about illegal behaviors, or if you're asking about behaviors that could get somebody in trouble, or if you're asking about something that is just kind of seen as society, people think that society looks down on it. So for example, mental health, there's a lot of stigma around that. So that might be a sensitive type of question, but even kind of things that seem innocuous, like, do you have a library card? If you ask that in the US, you get about 10 to 20% over people inflate whether they have a library card by about 10 to 20% because they think it's good to have a library card. They think it's socially acceptable to have a library card. And so that, even things like that can fall into that sensitive question bucket. So when you're thinking about behavioral questions, you really want to think about the amount of time you are asking people about. For highly salient events, things that people are not going to be doing that much, things that people are probably going to remember because it's a large life event, you can usually ask them about a longer period of time. For something that's low salient, something that's pretty common, something that you're not really going to encode in memory all that well, you could probably only get away with a much shorter period of time and still get accurate responding. So for publications, which, even if you are a researcher who publishes a lot, like publications may be pretty salient to you, you may be able to get away with asking in the last year. But for something like TV watching, which is a little bit more mundane, maybe you can only get away with in the last 2 weeks, maybe a month, maybe 2 months. With low salient events, people also tend to guesstimate. And rather than counting up each individual event, because it's cognitively easier. So one thing that can help with behavioral questions is something called aided recall, where you provide examples of what you care about to help people get thorough counts. And this can be either in the question itself or as a list of options they need to respond to. So if, for example, you ask me, how many organizations do you belong to? I first have to think, okay, what counts as an organization, and hope that what I think is the same as what you were thinking of, and then do accounting for each of those things, and that's harder for me as a respondent. And if I'm a little bit lazy or not particularly motivated, I might not go through the process of getting a good list of organizations before I start counting. So another thing I can do is say, how many organizations do you belong to? For example, clubs, professional societies, religious organizations, or unions. So I'm feeding the respondents kind of the categories of things I would like them to think about, which makes it a little easier. If it mattered to me, the counts for each of those organizations, rather than just asking how many organizations do you belong to and then give them a list, I could individually ask, how many clubs do you belong to? How many professional societies? How many religious organizations? How many unions? If you have a really long list, that can get really boring really fast. So you do want to kind of balance those two. But aided recall can be helpful, especially when you have these kind of broader categories of behaviors that you're asking about. Scoping is also really important. So by scoping, what I mean is making sure that the respondent and you as the survey researcher have the same kind of understanding of the question of what they're supposed to be reporting about. So clarify the who, the what, also the when, the why, if those make sense. So an example of this might be, think back to your last published paper. Did you share the data? So that might at first seem like a pretty straightforward question, but it actually has a lot of ambiguity in it. So by you, does that mean like I personally shared the data? Or should I include if my collaborator was the one who shared the data? Or like maybe I'm the senior author, so I told my grad student to do it. Does that still count? Also, what types of things count for sharing data? Like if I put in a footnote, like if you want the data, email me, does that count? Or am I, as the respondent, supposed to be thinking about a very specific type of data sharing? What if I put aggregate scores in the paper? Does that count as data? Like what level of data are we talking about here? So there's a lot of ambiguity in the question. And so different people may respond differently because they are thinking about a different scope than you as the researcher were. So a better version of this question might be, think back to your last published empirical article. Did you or one of your collaborators post the de-identified data file in a public repository? So I'm asking about a very specific behavior. They know who it applies to. They know kind of what type of thing it is. Obviously, this can go overboard really quickly, but this is kind of one of those things where you need to have some knowledge about the population you're going to be and the sample you're going to be asking about. If you are pretty certain that a concept will be understood in the same way by your entire sample, then you may not need to scope it nearly as much as if you think there are going to be different understandings of that question in different populations. So if I'm asking only psychologists if they share their study materials, I may not need to scope the question as much as if I'm asking a group of psychologists and biologists, because then I need to make sure that they are both understanding materials in the same way. So another thing with behavioral questions is that and this comes up again, response scales really matter. It seems like they shouldn't, because you're asking people how many times did you do a thing, but they are surprisingly sensitive. And part of this is that people tend to not use the extremes of scales. And so the type of scale you pick, you can get distortion because of the scale. The other thing is that the scale you pick can indicate to your survey respondents what you think is normal behavior. And so then you can get some of social desirability biases coming in, people not wanting to kind of admit to something that the researcher thinks might be extreme behavior. So an example, how many hours of TV did you watch last week? So if you look at these scales, if somebody is watching 6 hours of TV, I know where they're going to fall on both of those scales. So they both actually capture the exact same landscape of responses. But in one, 5 or more is the most extreme option. I'm asking really fine-grained information about below 5, and I'm checking everybody with 5 or more in the most extreme option. In the second one, I have these much larger buckets, so the most extreme option is 15 or more. And you actually get different response patterns across these two different types of scales, where you will see more people basically report that they are doing 5 or more hours of television watching in the second scale than in the first scale, because 5 or more is shunted into that extreme option in the first scale. It's not in the second scale. So one way to deal with this is to ask open-ended questions, because then you don't have a response scale that people can get information about. It does make it harder to code the data, because people may, like, one person might write out 1 hour, one person might put a number. So the data cleaning can be a little bit harder, but open-ended questions are kind of a good way to get around the response scale issue. So sensitive behavioral questions, which we talked a little bit about, in general, you will tend to see underreporting of socially undesirable behaviors and overreporting of socially desirable behaviors. And so, as I just mentioned, the response scales can indicate expected or normative behavior to participants and exacerbate these issues. So you're going to get these issues even with open-ended responses, but a response scale can exacerbate those. But open-ended response scales can help, especially with undesirable behavior, because you're not getting people any information about kind of what you as the survey researcher think is normative. For undesirable behavior, it can also be helpful to first ask, have you ever done this? And then ask about the frequency of the behavior. You'll tend to get more people admitting to having done it if you do it that way than if you just first go into, how many times have you done this? If you think a question is really threatening for somebody to answer, and you think that they are likely to know, it's a reasonable expectation that they would know how much other people are doing this action. Sometimes, rather than saying, hey, how much do you do this thing, it can be useful to use informant. So basically have people say, how much do others you know or a specific individual engage in this behavior, because it's less threatening to ask about somebody else than about yourself. It just needs to be something that you can reasonably expect them to be able to accurately answer. Right? If you ask me how many times I think somebody else does a very, very private behavior, I'm probably not going to know the answer to that. When you have highly sensitive questions, doing it online so they don't have to self-report it to an individual in the room can be really helpful. Also making really sure that the participant understands that their data is anonymous, that it is de-identified, so making them feel more secure that nobody is going to know who they are and what they responded. It doesn't fix the problem, but it can help. So attitude questions have some of the same problems as behavioral questions, but they have their own problems as well. So attitudes is kind of this broad concept, and you can think of attitudes as having three different components to them: a cognitive, an evaluative, and a behavioral component. So examples of those might be, for a cognitive component, how much does recycling help the environment? It's about beliefs about that attitude object. In this case, the attitude object is recycling. The evaluative component might be something like, how much do you favor recycling efforts? And the behavioral component might be, how likely are you to recycle? So a lot of times the behavioral component is asking about behavioral intentions, though it can't ask about previous behaviors. So when you're thinking about assessing attitudes, you may only care about one of these components, or you may care about multiple components. If you care about multiple components, you probably need to ask different questions for the different components of the attitude. Attitude questions are highly sensitive to the wording, to the response wording, to the specificity. They're really finicky. For a long side note, for a very long time, there was attitude researchers thought that maybe attitudes didn't exist because they were so hard to measure, and they had like an existential crisis. We think attitudes are real, but like they can be very hard to measure. So when you're asking about attitudes, you need to be really clear what the attitude object is. What exactly are you asking people to give their attitude about? This is similar to scoping with behavioral questions. You want to make sure that kind of everybody who's answering the question has the same understanding of what they're supposed to be responding about. So an example of this might be, do you think professors spend too much, about enough, or too little time mentoring students? So this is a cognitive attitude question. It's about their beliefs. So there is some ambiguity in this question. What types of professors? Am I asking about R1 professors or research-focused universities if R1s are not a thing in your country? Maybe I'm asking about small liberal arts colleges. What about community colleges? There are a lot of different types of professors that I could potentially be asking about. Also, what types of students am I asking about? Am I asking about doctoral students, master's students, undergraduates? So if different people are thinking about different attitude objects when they ask this question, I'm going to get a lot of noise in my survey that it's going to make it really hard to draw conclusions from that. So I want to try and make sure that everybody's understanding this question the same, so that they're all responding about the same attitude object. So another way I could phrase that question, so the original, do you think professors spend too much time, about enough, or too little time mentoring students? Another way to phrase that question would be, do you think professors at research-focused universities spend too much, about enough, or too little time mentoring PhD students? So now I've really narrowed in what I want to know about. So double-barreled questions can also come up, and this is similar where the attitude object is a little bit fuzzy. So a really obvious example of a double-barreled question: do you support or oppose preprints and open data? So if there's an and or an or in your question, that's a good indication that you might have a double-barreled question. And this is called double-barreled because of the fact that I am asking about preprints, and I'm also asking about open data, right? I'm asking about two different things in the same question. So this becomes really confusing because if somebody supports preprints but hates open data, how do they respond? Do they kind of take the average of those two things? Do they take the positive one? Do they take the negative one? And I also don't know that everybody's going to do the same thing. Like maybe some people will average, some people might skip, some people might respond to the first one. So once again, the responses just start to make, it's hard to interpret the responses. It's also harder for the person taking your survey to answer this question because they will be doing mental gymnastics trying to figure out what in the world they should do. Also, let's say that everybody did the same thing and that they averaged. So people who loved preprints, hated open data, would respond kind of at the neutral point of your survey. The problem is that then two different types of responses are choosing the same response option. People who really are neutral about both and people who have very dichotomized attitudes. And so there isn't kind of a one-to-one relationship between survey responses and what those mean anymore. And so either way, it gets really difficult to interpret those answers. A less obvious example of a double-barreled question, some people sometimes call this a 1.5-barreled question, I think. Do you support or oppose mandating preprints to increase the pace of scientific progress? So I don't have an and I don't have an or, so that's a good sign. But I've kind of linked two things together, right? I'm asking about mandating preprints, and I'm also asking about whether preprints actually increase the pace of science. So if I, as a respondent, support preprints, but I don't think they increase the pace of scientific progress, I support them for other reasons, I may have a hard time answering this question. And it may be hard to tell me apart from somebody who just generally hates preprints. So in both cases, I'm kind of asking about two things at once, and that makes it hard for me as a respondent, and it makes it really hard to understand what those responses mean when I go to analyze my survey. Leading questions also, they don't always fall into the second category, but a lot of times they do. So a leading question is when it's kind of really obvious to your survey respondent kind of how you want them to answer, or you ask the question in a way that is leading people towards one type of responding. So for example, if you just asked people, how much do you like cats, for example? That's just like a pretty, like non-threatening, not particularly leaning one way or the other type of question. A more leading version of that might be something like, how much do you like cats which have been shown to murder all the birds in your local community and lead to ecological problems? Like that's going to get a very different type of response than the first one. And you've kind of added on this other object to the end. It's not quite a double-barreled question, but it starts to go in that direction. So, right, in both of the examples I gave on the slide, you're kind of asking about two different types. You're asking about two different attitude objects, which make it hard to interpret your responses. Agree, disagree. So there are lots of different ways to ask attitude questions, right? There are lots of different scales you can use. Likert scales are a really common thing to use, where you basically give people, they're either unipolar. So for example, a unipolar is basically when the scale goes in one direction. So how much do you support something? You don't really have unsupport, in support, negative support, like that doesn't really make sense. So a scale like that might go on a unipolar one where it goes from no support to very much support. Whereas other ones, like an agree, disagree, have kind of a natural positive and negative end of the scale. Both of those can be referred to as Likert type items. They'll usually have anywhere from 5 to 9 points. And usually, ideally, each of the points is given a verbal label. And if you're likely to be asking attitude questions, one of the one of the resources I have linked at the end, there's a lot of research around exactly how you should label them, exactly how many points you should have. That's a little bit deep for this particular webinar, but one of the resources I have does kind of go over that in more depth. So there are lots of different Likert scales you could possibly have, right? There's like, dislike, there's approve, disapprove, agree, disagree, support, not, well, how much do you support? So many of them are perfectly valid. Agree, disagree questions can be very problematic. I'm not saying you should never use them, but I'm saying you should use them with a lot of caution. And there are kind of two reasons for this. So let's say I ask the question, I am usually pretty calm, and then gave people a 5-point Likert scale that goes from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And you're like, great, that seems straightforward, that seems easy. The problem comes in is when you're trying to map responses to specific, when you're trying to make sure that you have one response for different states. What if I am usually very calm? Not pretty calm, very calm. What if I'm always calm? It's not I'm usually calm, I'm always calm. That actually might make me disagree to this question, but for different reasons, right? In one, it's how calm am I? And that's why I'm disagreeing. And in the other one, I'm disagreeing because of the time component. So agree, disagree questions, unless they're really, really carefully crafted, can kind of fall into this sort of problem where people can have the same response, but for very different reasons. And so the response isn't actually telling you what you think it is, right? If somebody disagrees to this question, what do you know about them? You don't know that their frequency of calmness is different. You don't know if it's their amount of calmness is different. So it becomes really hard to interpret those. Agree, disagree questions, and this is also true for yes, no, and true, false, can also really suffer from acquiescence bias. So this is a bias where respondents will just tend to agree with you. Kind of whatever you're asking them about, they tend to agree. And so anything that has this like yes, no, true, false, agree, disagree can be particularly likely to have this acquiescence bias. There aren't ways to totally get rid of acquiescence bias other than not asking questions that tend to lead to it. But acquiescence bias can also be exacerbated by people who are really unmotivated to take your survey, or the survey questions being really hard. You're more likely to just be like, oh, I don't want to think this through, agree. Or if the survey is really long, further along in the survey, they can start to just get bored and tired, and this can pop up more. Certain types of people are also more or less likely to show acquiescence bias, but even in groups that don't have kind of psychological characteristics that lead to acquiescence bias, you can see it, especially if your scale is long and boring. You can see it anywhere. So agree, disagree questions are kind of tricky for a number of reasons. So if you have a lot of agree, disagree questions in your survey, I would just look at them really carefully and make sure that they're not running into these problems, and see if there's maybe another scale you could use instead that might be less likely to have these issues. So in general, for attitude questions, you want to make sure that you're asking about one question, one attitude object at a time. You want to make sure that different states have a clear and different response options. So this is what I was talking about with the agree, disagree, where multiple different kind of states would all answer disagree. And so it becomes hard to answer the response scale. You also want to make sure that the responses cover the kind of landscape that you have. So if you are asking an attitude question, and it's a bipolar scale, so you have a negative and a positive end. If you do not give people a neutral point, and you actually think that a neutral attitude is like a possibility in that space, then you're going to force people into basically self-reporting an attitude, positive or negative, that they don't have. Whereas if you give them a neutral point, then they can actually self-report the attitude that they have. So it's just important to think through and make sure that you have all the responses that you think are possible. The last point is just choose your response scales very carefully. So for example, approve, disapprove, and like, dislike. Kind of at face value, you might think, oh, those are pretty similar, like it doesn't matter which one I choose. But some people have done studies and they find that you get different levels of responding and different levels of, responding is not a word, different levels of responding and different endorsement depending on which one you use because of the fact that they have slightly different connotations. I think the original study was actually done on daylight savings time, but a really good example of this might be if you ask me if I like eating vegetables, I will say no, I do not like vegetables. Do I disapprove of vegetables, like as a concept? No. So if you ask me, do I disapprove of vegetables, I may say neutral or approve, I don't know. But I'm probably not gonna say disapprove. Whereas if you ask me, do you like or dislike vegetables, I will almost certainly say I dislike them. So you wanna think through, and this is where it can be really good to have that, look back at your research questions and make sure that the response scale that you're using is really answering the question that you have. So if you really care about disapproval or if you really care about support, you may want to use a approve, disapprove, how much do you support scale rather than just using a like, dislike scale, because that's not actually asking the question you want people to answer, and you can get different responses depending on that exact wording. If you are writing up a scale in a language that is not your primary language or a language that you maybe don't have as much familiarity with, or if you're translating a scale into another language, this can get really tricky. So it can be helpful to, if you're translating it into another language, a lot of people do something where they translate it into that other language and then translate it back into the first language, so you can kind of see how much things shifted and make sure that the translation is kind of getting at what you want. But it can also be helpful, even if it's your own original language, to talk through exactly what you're asking people to make sure that you're not accidentally getting into a slightly different take than you meant to with the response scale you chose. So behavioral intentions are a type or one of those components of attitudes. But one thing about them that makes them really tricky is if you ask a really general attitude and then a really specific behavioral intention, they usually do not correlate. And so you want to, if you are interested in behavioral intentions and kind of the relationship between those and attitudes, you want to make sure that you ask specific attitude questions and specific behavioral intentions questions. So for example, if you wanted to look at recycling, or actually, yeah, so if you wanted to look at recycling, if you asked a general attitude question, how much do you like or dislike recycling, and then a very specific behavioral intention of, you know, how likely are you to go to a recycling center to drop off your cans, those may have very different, those may not really have any relationship to one another. Whereas if you asked something like, how much do you like or dislike taking recycling to a recycling center, and then asking the same behavioral intention question, those will tend to match up better. So you just want to make sure that if you're looking to do that type of analysis, that you kind of think through carefully what your attitude wording and what your behavioral intention wording is. For behavioral intentions, likelihood response scales or questions can be particularly useful. So like, how likely are you to do this? If you are using banded frequency scales, so like, how many times in the next month do you think you are going to go drop off your cans at the recycling center? You can run into the same issues as we talked about with behavioral response scales, where this specific banding you choose and the specific response options you choose can kind of signal something to respondents, and that can change their responding. So if you want to ask a frequency rather than a likelihood, you may want to think about using an open-ended response. It doesn't mean you have to, but it's just something to think through and the pros and cons. Or be really careful on how you choose your response frequency options. So that was kind of a very quick crash course into the types of things that can go wrong when you're crafting individual questions. But right, when you're doing a survey, it's not individual questions. It's you have to take those questions and put them in a specific order, and that can alter responding as well. So when you're taking questions and putting them into a survey, there are a couple of kind of rules of thumb to follow. The first is that generally you want to put your more important and more integral questions first. And this is for a couple of reasons. One, you are going to get people who drop out partway through your survey. So if there are questions that you want responses from everyone, you want to put those first. Also, if you put really boring questions first, people may tend to drop out of your survey. This is not a rule, but like usually the demographic questions are kind of the boring ones, and the questions that are actually important to your survey are the more interesting ones. Usually demographics you put at the end, both because they are oftentimes less important and just because they're more boring and mundane. A caveat to this rule, though, is that if you need those demographic questions for screening participants to determine their eligibility, like if you only want people who are women responding to your survey, like you need to know for every person who enters your survey whether they self-identify as female or not. So like that question needs to go basically at the first part of your survey. If you are doing some sort of branching logic, like you're asking early career and late career researchers different questions, obviously that needs to go much higher up in your survey. If you need a demographic variable because that is really going to affect the analysis for your survey, and it's like really integral to a research question, then that needs to go higher up in your survey. Generally though, demographics, you tend to check at the end. You also want to put questions that you think are likely to be more threatening to participants, that they may be less likely to want to answer further into your survey. If they enter your survey and the first question you ask them is, have you ever used cocaine? They may get a little bit weirded out by that and leave. So you want to kind of ease them in to things. And in general, you want to put more general questions before more specific questions because you can get order effects. So for example, if you ask me, how much do I, how much do I enjoy swimming? And then you ask me, how much do you enjoy outdoor activities? I may still be thinking about swimming while I'm answering the second question. And so you can get bleed over. Whereas if you ask the reverse, one particular activity may not be more salient than the others. And so in general, you want to put the general questions before the specific ones. You can also get contrast effects depending on question wording, or sorry, question order. So you kind of want to think through the specific order of questions on a similar topic, just to make sure that you're decreasing the likelihood of those. Also, in general, you want to try and keep your survey shorter rather than longer. And this, right, a survey has to be a certain length to answer the questions you want to answer. But the longer it gets, one, the more dropout you're gonna have across it. Two, it may be harder to get people to want to take the survey in the first place, especially if you are not going to be paying anyone. And also, the longer the survey gets, the more acquiescence can become a problem because people get bored, they get lazy, and they may just start either agreeing with things, or if it's like behavioral response questions, they may not try to recall or try and recall as accurately or count as accurately anymore. So when you're when you have your set of research questions and you have the set of survey questions that you think you want, a really important thing to do is give it to a couple of people, have them time it, and think through, really, do I actually need all these questions? And if the answer is yes, and your survey is really long, you may want to look into ways of maybe getting some compensation, either through paying individual participants or doing a lottery. But if it's really long and a lot of those questions were just like, oh, it might be nice to know if, you may want to cut those, or be really careful about where you put them in the survey. And when I say, so there's no hard and fast rule. Personally, what I've noticed is in a survey where I'm not paying people, 10 minutes seems to be kind of a point that people really pay attention to. So it's under 10 minutes, I get much higher responding than if it's like 15 or 20 minutes, because that seems like a higher commitment to people. That's not a hard and fast rule, that's just like in my personal experience, but it is something to think about. You also want to try and make the questions easy for your respondents to answer, right? The more mental gymnastics they have to go through, the harder it's going to be for them, the more tired they're going to get, the less likely they may be to answer accurately or just stop answering altogether. So part of this is asking really clear questions so that they don't have to think, okay, what do they mean by this? Another is to group questions on similar topics together, so that they have to basically do less mental gymnastics switching from topic to topic. You also, as much as possible, want to give people consistent response scales. If they have to switch response scales every single question, that's going to be harder than if you can come up with a consistent response scale. You also want to make sure that your response scales go in the same direction throughout the whole survey. So you want to, if you decide that you want to go from like negative to positive, you want to make sure that all your response scales go negative to positive. You could do the other way around, that's totally fine. In general, you want to keep it consistent because people may not read the response scales all that closely, especially if it's the same responses. And so if you're flipping the order, they may miss that you flipped the order. Now, if your survey is really long and you have a lot of questions on the same topic and the response scale is exactly the same, this can get really boring really fast. So while these are general, try and group things together, try and keep a consistent topic. If you have like a really long list of things people need to get through, you may want to switch it up a bit, just so people don't get really bored. But these are things that are generally going to make it a little bit easier for people to get through the survey. So pilot testing surveys is really important. There's not one hard and fast rule about how to pilot test, but basically for pilot testing, you're test driving your survey, because no matter how many times you look at your survey, there are going to be things that you miss. It's really hard to think in the mind of somebody else. And so this is just really good practice to do. So in general, for pilot testing surveys, you want to get respondents from your actual population of interest. So if you are interested in attitudes of early career researchers, you want to pilot your survey with some early career researchers. They're not going to be part of your actual sample though, because your survey is probably going to change. You might also include people with like deep domain knowledge. So if you're doing a survey about how early career researchers feel about open access, you want to pilot test it with some early career research people, but you also may want to run it by some people who have deep domain knowledge of open access topics, so that they might have, oh, you're missing something, or oh, this is a response I commonly see that you're not picking up on. So when you pilot test it with them, you're basically asking them to take the survey and then look for and relay to you places where they felt that the questions or the instructions were really confusing, they didn't quite know what you meant. If they felt like there were missing response options, if they were going through it and were like, I can't answer this question the way I want because you didn't give the response that was the one for me. If they feel like there are ordering issues, or if there are general, and this relates to confusing questions, but especially if there are question wording issues around ambiguity, double-barreledness, if they feel like you have some really leading questions in there. Usually you're going to want to do at least one round of pilot testing. If the pilot testing comes back and you have to redraft a lot, then you may want to do a couple rounds of pilot testing. I usually will do kind of some internal pilot testing where I have other people from the center who know about some of the stuff just give me their initial gut reactions. And then once I have a good draft, then start pilot testing it officially with kind of members of the actual population I'm interested in. If you have a lot, if your population is very diverse, it's hard to get like somebody from each of the specific subpopulations, but you want to make sure, like if you are sending your survey to biologists and like molecular biologists and ecologists and paleontologists, because you're interested in life science in general, you may want to try and get some pilot testers from those diverse groups to make sure that the questions make sense to everybody who you're likely going to be encountering. There's no hard and fast rule about how many people have to say it's a problem for it to be a problem. Like if everybody says, oh yeah, this question's really confusing, then you probably have an issue. But if only one, like even if only one person says the question's a problem, and you look at the question and you realize, oh, it's double-barreled, you probably want to change it. So I'm not going to go into this in depth. So looking into whether you need to get ethics or IRB approval for your survey. I know the rules in the US. I do not feel comfortable speaking to the rules in any other country. So what I will say is that many times, though not always, surveys will need to go through ethics review and get approval. So if you are thinking about doing a survey, you should talk to your local university ethics review or IRB or whatever it happens to be called at your university to check whether you need to go through approval, and then if you do, make sure you get approval. All right, so deploying your survey. So once you have crafted all your questions, you've put them into the survey format, you've piloted that, you think that your survey is as good as it's going to get, you actually have to release it into the wild. So the big thing about this is you have to decide on a sampling strategy. And this is where knowing your survey population is really important, because if you don't know your survey population, you cannot pick a sampling strategy. So sampling strategies are basically who takes your survey, and these can be grouped into two big bins. The first is probabilistic sampling. And so in probabilistic sampling, you have your population of interest. Who do you want to generalize your findings to? And that could be, you know, all researchers, it could be US researchers, it could be early career researchers in England. Like this, some populations of interest are really broad, some are very specific. A sampling frame is a list of the target population that you will use to generate your sample. So if I am interested in psychology researchers in the US, my sampling frame, or let's say psychology faculty at tenure track universities in the United States, that would be my survey population. My sampling frame would be a list of all of those people, or as close to all of those people as I can get. And then from that, I would generate a sample. that sample might be the whole population if it's really small and it's really easy to survey all of them, or it might be a random subsample. In probabilistic sampling, each member of your population has a known non-zero chance of being in the sample. And so this is why you need to know your sample to figure out kind of what's the likelihood of any individual getting into, or you need to know your population so that you know that everybody has a non-zero chance of getting in. There are different ways to do probabilistic sampling. So the easiest one is something called simple random sample. And that is where you have your population, you have your sampling frame, you decide how many people you're going to survey, and then everybody gets the exact same likelihood of getting in that sample. It's a simple random draw. There are other types of probabilistic sampling. One other one that is a little bit more complicated is something called a stratified sample. And so this is where, okay, so let's say that you are interested in tenure track faculty, but you want to make sure that you have equal numbers of male and female faculty, because for you that's really important for your analysis. You need to have like you want to make sure that you have representation across the genders. If there are kind of different rates of men and women in your survey population, if you just do a random sample, especially if your random sample is very small in relation to your population, you may get really low rates of female faculty in your survey. So in a stratified sample, you kind of group your population by different characteristics that are important to you to have in your sample. And then for each of those groups, you randomly sample within that group. So in this case, I would stratify by gender. So I would kind of group everybody in my population by gender, and then I would randomly sample the women and randomly sample the men, and then send out the survey to that random sample. You do have to take stratified sampling. Can be helpful because it can help you, make sure that you are seeing pieces of your population that are important to you if you have these kind of subgroups that you're interested in. It is a little bit more complicated to do, both just on the generating the sample front and on the analysis front, but it can be a useful thing to know about. So non-probabilistic sampling is basically when you're just trying to find a suitable collection of respondents. So you're not figuring out who all is in your population, then taking a random sample of that. You are just kind of saying, who might be good to take this survey? There are multiple ways to do non-probabilistic sampling. Kind of the most common one is something called convenience sampling. That is literally when your sample is whoever is most convenient to get to take your survey. Another type, and there are many types, these are just two. Another one is called snowball sampling, and that is when you get an initial pool of respondents and then you get them to recruit other people to take your survey. So it snowballs, it gets larger as you go along. This can be really useful if it's kind of hard to identify people in the population, but you think that once you identify some people, they will kind of know who else is in that population, or if the population is really small and it's really rare. So biases to worry about when you're thinking about how you sample. For probabilistic sampling, you can have coverage bias, and this is when you are missing population members in your sampling frame. So if your population is researchers and you're just sampling your sampling frame is based on who the corresponding authors are on journal articles, depending on your field, that may tend to get you more senior people. So you may be missing early career researchers. You're definitely going to be missing early career researchers who haven't published yet. So that might be a coverage bias problem. Non-response bias is when certain types of people may be less likely to take your survey than other types of people. So if you're doing a survey on open access journals, and you specifically market it as trying to understand the benefits of open access, people who don't like open access may be less likely to take your survey. selection bias can also happen. So if different population members have different unaccounted for probabilities of being selected into your sample. So if you did the corresponding author example from above, if somebody has been a corresponding author on more than one paper, they may have a higher likelihood of getting in your sample than somebody who's only been a corresponding author on one article. So basically, what can happen with all of these biases is that your sample and your population start to diverge more and more. And the more those diverge, the harder it is to generalize from your sample back to your population. So the pros of the two different types, non-probability sampling is often easier. That's not necessarily always the case, especially if your population of interest is really small, but it can be easier. But probability sampling can usually be better for generalizability, as long as you don't have big issues with those biases I covered. But because you know your population and you know the characteristics of it, it's oftentimes a lot easier to tell what types of biases you're seeing and what amounts of that bias you have, because you can compare your sample to your population characteristics. Like those problems can show up in non-probability sampling as well, like non-response bias is a probability for for simple convenient samples. But it's harder to tell how much of it you're getting because you don't actually know who saw your survey, and so you can't tell how many people were responding, and it gets more complicated. The cons of each type, it's harder to generalize from samples to population generally with non-probability sampling because of the fact that it's harder to figure out like how characteristic your sample is of your population. But for large populations of interest, it can be really hard to develop a sampling frame for probabilistic sampling. If you have a rare population, it may be hard to find them in the first place. So if you can use probability sampling while taking all those biases into account when you're interpreting results. Probability sampling does not magically fix all your problems, it just makes it a little bit easier to tell how much of a problem it is. If you are going to be using convenience sampling, a lot of people use convenience sampling. I use convenience sampling. It is not like a black mark or anything, but you do want to try and cast as wide of a net as possible to decrease the problems you're going to have. Where if you just throw a poll up on Twitter, unless your population of interest is people who are on Twitter, you're probably going to be missing a huge swath of your population of interest. So you want to try and get, like if you're interested in researchers, maybe you put something up on Twitter, on Facebook, on listservs, on departmental lists, on society email lists. See if you can partner with groups who might have email lists that you can use. So trying to spread as wide of a net as you possibly can to get more members of that population at least getting exposed to your survey. Whether they take it or not is a second question. And be very careful when you are trying to speak about your population in general from your sample. The more your sample and your population diverge, whether you're using probability or non-probabilistic sampling, the harder it is to say something about that population in general from your survey sample in particular. And so I just wanted to do really quick on alternative methods, right? I've told you the pros and the cons of surveys. Surveys are not the only gig in town. There are a lot of other really useful things you can do that can answer some of the same questions you might be trying to answer with a survey. So the first is a lit review. Just, you know, there's a lot out there. Sometimes somebody has already answered this question. A lit review is kind of your first stop. And even if nobody's answered it, as we talked about before, it can still be useful for kind of finding potential questions to use or to maybe redraft for your purposes. A second one is interviews and focus groups. I talked about this as something you might want to do before you do your survey, but kind of qualitative interviews can be really useful in their own right. You're usually getting a much smaller sample, so generalization is usually really, really hard, but if you want to really dig into a concept and have the freedom to kind of go down these different paths, qualitative interviews can be really useful. And there's a whole literature on that type of data collection. Another one is just coding public material. So if you want to know what the rate of a certain type of behavior is, and you want really accurate rate counts, asking people is one way to do it, but you could just go in and, if that material is public, literally code it up. So if I'm interested in what is the rate and types of data sharing in a particular discipline, it might be easier and more accurate for me to actually look at, you know, all the articles published in specific journals over specific years and literally count up what is the rate of data sharing in those journals to get a rate count for the field as a whole. Those are complicated. They have their own sets of pros and cons, but that's one thing to think about, especially if you're asking about behaviors. Is there another way that I could find out these behaviors, and are those pros and cons better or worse than a survey? Another one is small scale studies. So if you are asking about behavioral intentions, and like, right, it's hard to measure if somebody goes to the recycling center unless you stand outside of a recycling center, and that's like complicated and slightly creepy. But depending on what behavioral intentions you're asking about, it might be something that's actually less complicated to do. And if that behavioral intention is what you're really interested in, it might be easier to do a small scale study than to do a survey about it. So for example, if I'm interested in, if originally I was going to ask people, like, if somebody emailed you, how likely would you be to answer the email for the data, or how much do you intend to give people data if they emailed you? That might be hard for people to answer. They might not take into account life is crazy, life is complicated. So another way for me to answer that question is literally just to email people. So look through papers from journals, find the ones who have said emailed me, email them, and then see what the response rate is. And there are some papers that have done this, and it's actually really great data because it actually shows you what is the real level of responding. And sometimes you can combine that with a survey. So it can be nice to juxtapose what do people say they'll do versus what they actually do. But if really what you care about is what do people actually do, a small scale study could be another way to go as opposed to a survey. So I wanted to leave time for questions, but I did want to put some further readings because this is complicated. There's a really good best practices for questionnaire design paper by John Krosnick and colleagues. It's open access. I put the link here. It goes into some of what I've talked about, but it also goes into some other things in more detail. There is, I think, a really accessible book called Asking Questions, A Definitive Guide to Questionnaire Design. It is a book, so it's longer, but the chapters are really nice. It has specific chapters for like behaviors and attitudes and sensitive behaviors and non-sensitive behaviors. So you can kind of dip in and dip out pretty easily. Many libraries will have this book. I have also found it online, but I'm not exactly sure how official that was online or not, so I didn't want to give out the link. But I would say first look at your university library. Some chapters may also be posted. And then if you're going to do Likert scale items, sometimes those could be hard to think of your own, especially if you're labeling all the points. So I just linked a nice resource that shows kind of for different Likert items with different scales like informativeness, support, like, dislike, some response scale options that they've come up with for 5 and 7 point scales that you can reuse. All right, so I'd like to open up to questions in kind of the last 15, 20 minutes we have.
Right, so I'm back here to help with the questions as well. I can see we have first a question from Jeff, which was about the pilot runs for surveys. Is there any rules, or do you have any recommendations about how big should the pilot be?
That's a good question. I've seen really, really varied suggestions on this. Like, some people also say do them in person, some say it's fine to do online. Especially if you're doing them in person, you may have to use fewer than if you're emailing it out to some people. Also, if it's a small population, the more people you sync into piloting, the less you will have for your actual survey. I'll try to pilot with like 5 to 10 people. If it's something where the population is pretty consistent. If it's a population that has kind of subpopulations within it, I will probably try and get a few people from those different subpopulations. So as the number of subpopulations grows, I may need to get more respondents. It's this balance between, like, usually more data is better, but at some point you get so much that like it just gets too much. So like 5 to 10 is probably a decent one, but some people will say pilot with 30 or 40. But a lot of times those are much larger surveys. So
can I just follow up on that and just ask, so how much, so given that you've done a pilot with however many people that you've thought reasonable, how much of a change do you think can be done to the questionnaire before you need to do another pilot?
Right. If somebody had if a couple of people had specific problems with like individual survey items and it wasn't much of your survey and their feedback was very specific. So if it was something like you need to add a neutral point, that's a really clear change that you can make. If their feedback was something like, I do not understand this question, that might be something where, one, you follow up with your pilot people, because normally the piloters, you know who they are. So you can email them and be like, hey, can we chat online? Like you said, it was confusing. I want to dig into why it was confusing. If you fix that question, you might send it back out to the original piloters and say, hey, here's the new wording I was looking at. Does this make more sense? If it was something where you had to change like massive pieces of your survey, like you had to change over a lot of response options, you had to change over a ton of the questions you were asking, you had to really flip orders, then that might be a time when you want to send it back out to new people who don't have the memory of what it used to look like. There's not a hard and fast rule though. Yeah, unfortunately.
That's all right. So another question would be about languages. So you were talking about translations, but in what happens in actual fact, I think in many cases, is that the surveys are being provided in English only.
Yeah.
And do you know anything, or is there some literature that people can look into what happens when you disseminate surveys in English to populations that you have a reason to believe that will understand English?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't specifically know myself about kind of what best practices for that are. My gut reaction though would be, if you expect to be sending out your survey to a group that many of them may be taking it in their second language, as much as possible, try to use very clear language, and try to not use overly jargony stuff, unless it's like scientific jargon where you think it's going to be mostly known within the community. I would tend to follow the same rules as if I was putting together a lecture for a class where I thought that it was likely that I was going to have a lot of non-native speakers in the class. So you want to thread that needle between making sure that you're really asking what you want to know, but not using like overly jargony or overly slangy language.
Okay, thank you. Another question here is from Guido. What do you consider to be optimal length of a survey? Could you give a number to this?
I don't want to get a number because, okay, so like one 10-minute survey could feel very different than another 10-minute survey. Like if you are asking me to list, for example, how often I have bought different types of food items in the last 2 weeks, and you ask me so many food items that takes me 10 minutes, I am going to hate you as a survey respondent. Like that is not going to be fun for me. It's going to be so boring. On the other hand, if you're asking me, a few food items, but you're also asking me about like my eating behavior and my TV behavior and like various things, 10 minutes may not feel nearly as long. So that's something where your pilot testers can help you out. They can be like, I was so bored. Or like, yeah, this felt reasonable. Generally, if I'm not paying anyone, I will tend to get it around 10 minutes, give or take 5. If I'm paying people, then I can tend to ask more, but the more I ask, the more I probably am going to need to pay them. So COS is doing it's a study with a survey in it, but it's going to take people a long time. We think it's going to take them like an hour because they have to do a bunch of reading inside. So we're going to pay them quite a bit of money because we think if we don't know, it's going to take it. So like that's a balancing act. Yeah.
Okay. I wonder if there are any more questions at the moment. Oh yeah, here we go. That's going back to something that I suppose is about the fact that we're lacking in research a little bit on the survey side. There's a question of someone, maybe yourself or someone from OSF, would be willing to check some of the surveys that the ambassadors are working on.
I mean, I'm happy to like if you send me an hour-long survey, I may not be able to look it over, but if you send me a survey that's like shorter, I'm happy to give it a once-over and see if anything just like blatantly pops out to me. Depending on what your survey is on though, if it's something where I don't necessarily have, like if it's something that I wouldn't be part of your survey population, you would probably just want to treat me not as part of your pilot pool, but one of those just like somebody who's going to look over it for like massive issues. But yeah, like if it's on the shorter end, I'm happy to just give it a glance over and see if there's anything that like really strikes me.
Okay. One more question on the pilot side of things. So I think that partially goes to the fact that our ambassadors are not that familiar with maybe running surveys as other researchers. So should you try and analyze the pilot stage data to find out if you're actually able to analyze the information that you're getting in a way that you were expecting?
So usually you don't analyze pilot data. A true pilot is for survey work or either for experimental work actually, is really just making sure that your process works. So you usually would not analyze the pilot data because one, it's pilot, and so if your survey changes, like you can't pool that. But also because a pilot is very little information, right? If you're only getting 5 or 10 people to pilot test it, the results from that aren't going to be very valid. You're mostly going to be picking up on noise if you see anything. One thing though that can be useful to do if you, like sometimes if I have pilot data, I will start to write my analysis scripts off of that pilot data. I don't ever plan to analyze it, but it shows me exactly what my data is going to look like, so I can start writing up my analysis scripts. And I have data to play with so I can see if there are any errors in my code. Some survey programs like Qualtrics will actually allow you to generate fake responses, so you can do the same sort of thing. One thing that can be helpful with pilot data, if you haven't done this already, is when you're looking at the pilot data, have your research questions there and be like, okay, given that this person answered this question this way, does that really tell me what I want to know? Like you can do that with fake data, but sometimes when you have just like 5 pieces of real data, you can realize, oh my God, I'm missing something really important. So you can analyze it in terms of like sanity checks, in terms of debugging code, in terms of just making sure that you have all the questions you needed and that you understand how the response options fit back in with your research questions. You shouldn't analyze it in terms of pooling it with your actual survey data and then drawing conclusions from it, if that makes sense.
All right. Okay. Thank you. I think we might have a time for like maybe 1 or 2 more questions. So if there is any more questions, please do be quick about it.
Side note to piloting, one thing I have seen, and this is valid to do, is sometimes if you're doing like a really thorough qualitative interview or focus group to help you design your survey, I have seen people who will write up that qualitative piece as kind of its own section of a paper because it does have really rich information in there, and then they do the survey off of it. But usually that's when you're doing kind of a much deeper, larger set of qualitative interviews and focus groups.
Okay. What about sensitive questions? Is there any literature about how to kind of appropriately ask them, or is there somewhere to go for that kind of advice?
Yeah, so there is a literature on this. So some of that, so the book I linked, or not linked to, but the book does have a chapter on specifically sensitive behavioral questions. Some of that to deal with like, so there are some tricks with that. There's probably other PDFs out there that might go into it deeper. Like there is a whole literature on this just because people do have to ask about illegal behavior or stigmatized behavior. So I would say if you are doing a questionnaire where you think you are likely to run into those problems, one, a literature review can be really useful in those cases because like, for example, if you were asking about depression, like there are a lot of scales out there for depression. So you may want to look at how other people have asked that question before. Are there validated scales? Is there a typical way that they ease people into those questions? But you may also want to kind of read up either in the book or maybe by doing kind of a little review on your own about sensitive data to see if there are any other good rules of thumb around that. But yeah, in general, right, if you think it's a stigmatized behavior, asking have you ever done it first, and then getting into frequency, asking open-ended questions so you're not making the participants feel like you have an expectation around how often they're going to do that. Trying to not have it be literally the first thing in your survey, and also making participants really, as much as you can, talk about how you are going to deal with their data. That may be a time where people feel a lot more comfortable if the data is never shared, especially if it's something that cannot be de-identified, and not doing it in person. It's really awkward to have to answer a depression scale to a person's face if they are not like a therapist that you are going to. So if you're asking about kind of sensitive topics, then doing it online may be a better way to go.
Speaking of that, is there any situation in which doing the survey in person would be a better approach?
Oh, that's a good question. There probably is, but I don't actually know off the top of my head. I think that's just because I was never in a position to do an in-person survey or a phone survey. I mean, one thing, for example, if you're doing like evaluations, like if you did a course and you're asking people to evaluate the course, sometimes you will get higher rates of responding if you hand out a paper survey at the end of the course and say, hey, can you please take this? And like you leave the room. So people are kind of sure that nobody's going to know who did what. Rather than sending out a link afterwards, you will tend to get better responding if you literally hand out a physical survey when it's salient in people's minds. Than if you send the link afterwards. So depending on what you're doing, that might be a time where you want to use a non-online version, but something that's not quite reading in person. I will say that if you are doing the survey verbally, either over the phone or sitting with people, you do want to really carefully think through how that might change the types of questions you answer, because people have to keep the entire question in short-term memory. And so some response scales may not work as well in person as they do online. And there is a literature on that. I just did not give any resources on it because I didn't think it was likely that of you would be doing in-person surveys. But if you want to do an in-person survey, that is something to look into.
Okay. Right, so we're just over the time. I didn't see any more questions, so we can potentially close the session for today. Thank you, Courtney, so much for sharing your expertise with us, and even offering to do some follow-up checkups if there are some questions coming your way. So yeah, thank you so much. And this session has been recorded for anybody who might still be unsure about that. And we'll be sharing the recording through the usual channels.
And I'll also send you a link to where the slides are posted. So if anybody wants to look over the slides again, hopefully you can send it out to the ambassador list. I forgot to put in where I posted the slides. Yeah.
That's all right. Okay, well, if you can just pass it on to me, I'll make sure that everybody has access to it.
All right, great. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Courtney. Bye.